What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a little Pillars of Eternity lore, specifically about Thaos X Arkannon. So before we jump into that, I just want to say tons of spoilers for the games. More the first game than the second, but very much so tons of spoilers. Diving right into this, Thaos is, of course, the primary antagonist of the first game. However, his involvement in the world of Eora runs much deeper than that, going all the way back to when the Iguithans first performed their apotheosis into gods. So we don't know too much about Thaos before that. However, we do know that he was selected by the Iguithans to act as the go-between, so to speak, between the gods and the world of Eora, where he would act as their agent spreading their faith, that they had, of course, just established. Now, this is important, and I want to take a quick aside to talk about something that isn't Thaos. When the Iguithans made the gods, they specifically made them with the idea that Woedica would lead them, that Woedica would be the strongest god. However, the other gods very quickly decided they didn't like that, and they used their combined power to bring Woedica down to a level playing field with the rest of them, making all of the gods have roughly the same amount of power, whereas Woedica used to be stronger than the rest of them. This is why Woedica is referred to the queen that was. Which brings us back to Thaos. Thaos agreed to be the go-between between specifically Woedica and the rest of the world and spread that faith. Thaos served Woedica specifically. And then, when she lost her status as the strongest god and became the queen that was, Thaos still specifically served her as one of her favored. Now, being Woedica's favored is an important thing, especially for Thaos, because being Woedica's favored means that she will bypass a lot of the rules of how the universe works, so to speak, specifically to keep her agents moving. Now, the way this works for Thaos, and what allows him to continue to be her agent across roughly 2,000 years, is that his soul is always awakened with all of its previous knowledge of its previous lives every single time he is reborn. Because souls get reincarnated in the world of Eora, but typically they don't remember their past lives. However, Woedica makes sure that Thaos always remembers his past lives, and that this won't drive him crazy, as it often does with other people. So, because of that, he has effectively lived for roughly 2,000-ish years, and has learned a great many things in that time, and he agreed to spread the faith of the gods his society, the Iguithans, had created. Now, despite Woedica's fall, this roughly continues as planned. He founds the Leaden Key, which is then used as a missionary service of sorts, to spread the new faith that they had just made, which overall works very well, up until the point one of his missionaries brings on board a convert known as Eora. She becomes a follower of this new faith. However, one day she manages to overhear a conversation between missionaries of Thaos' new faith, Iguithans, where they basically spoke out of turn about how the gods were made and that they weren't actually real. Eora uses this information to start gaining her own following, where she explains to people that these missionaries aren't what they claim to be. Now, Thaos does not react well to this, and turns his missionaries into an inquisition, where basically anyone, such as Eora and her followers, start questioning their faith. They are just flat out murdered, and they are just removed from history, basically. And this is where Thaos and his missionaries start basically rooting out heresy and heathens, as they put it, and start burning people. However, this isn't very effective because Eora manages to escape most of this. And for every person they kill, they're basically just fueling Eora's point that these missionaries aren't who they say that they are. This goes on until eventually Eora is captured, thanks to the previous life of your Watcher from the first game. Eora is eventually captured, killed, and her soul imprisoned in the Soul Prison underneath Sun and Shadow. Now, after this happens, Thaos is pretty much successful in his goal of spreading the faith of the Iguithan gods all across the world. They become basically the one religion that the world uses. And while certain societies might interpret it a little differently, and this is why you see certain places call gods different things, it is ultimately the same god, and even they recognize that. Now, that brings us into slightly more current times as far as this timeline goes, about 20 years or so before the first game, where we have the Saints' War, where one of the gods, Eothas, decides that the world needs to know that the gods aren't real, and thus begins the Saints' War, where Saint Weidwin, which is the guy Eothas possessed in a way, to use as a tool to show the world about the gods, is ultimately killed by the other gods. Now, as a sort of punishment for this, Thaos activates Engwithan machinery, which brings about what's called Widewind's Legacy, which is where all the newborns around the Deerwood area aren't born with souls and become hollow-born. But, as we know from the game, what Thaos is actually doing is redirecting all of these souls to Sun and Shadow, so he can restore Woedica as the Queen of the Gods using all of these extra souls. So basically, Thaos is just being an opportunist and using the situation between the gods as well as the fact that a saint just died who was largely seen as a god himself in order to potentially restore Woedica to her rightful place at the head of the gods. Now, throughout the game, of course, we see this fail because of our actions, and ultimately, we have our confrontation with Thaos as the Watcher, where we see Thaos killed. But before we get into that, it's worth mentioning that throughout the first game, we also see Thaos attempt to discredit animancy at every turn. Now, this is something I want to talk about because it's part of Thaos's attempt to make sure that the secret of the Engwithans becoming gods stays a secret. He doesn't want people studying souls and finding out about it. Now, this is important because it's done at Woedica's direction. Specifically Woedica's. In talking to the gods in the first game, we learn that most of them don't actually care that the Kith, or the sentient races if you will, are studying souls through animancy. Most of them don't care. They see it as important, actually, for the growth of all people, that they should actually be struggling to better themselves and find ways to become better and strengthen their souls and all that kind of thing. However, Woedica is dedicated to keeping the gods a secret. That's her big thing. And she uses Thaos to help discredit animancy. Now, she doesn't involve herself directly because of an agreement between the gods that they will not interfere in Kith affairs. This is why she uses Thaos as her agent in most of this, instead of involving herself directly in any way. Basically, side-skirting the gods' agreement and using a loophole to still do her bidding. Now, that said, as I mentioned, regardless of your stance on any of this, you will confront Thaos at the end of the first game. However, it's worth mentioning, you can still do what he wanted to do anyway and give the souls to Woedica. That is one of the possible endings of that game. Now, this is part of a little bit of what I want to talk about with what happens to Thaos. You have a choice at the end of the game of exactly what happens to Thaos. Now, you can just return his soul to the cycle, which is the wheel, and keep his memories intact so he knows who he was. Now, this is important because when you kill Thaos at the end of Pillars of Eternity 1, it's largely assumed that he, if he fails here, has lost Woedica's favor, and thus is no longer one of his favored, and thus isn't granting all of his boons and stuff that he's had. Now, while returning his soul with his memories intact is obviously dangerous, if you side with Woedica, it's kind of implied that you basically take Thaos's place on this, and that in losing his favored status of Woedica, he basically just becomes another guy. That said, you can also choose to just flat out destroy his soul, giving him a true death even in a world where the world recycles all of its souls. You can banish him to the soul prison underneath the Court of Penitence, where the Sun and Shadow is. You can return his soul to the wheel and erase all of his memories, allowing him to just be a regular person. All of those are options, and the game ends in a variety of ways. But that is basically who Thaos X Arkannon is, his role in the Pillars of Eternity universe, and some of the things he has done to ensure that the gods he helped create personally stayed a secret, and that the world continued to follow that faith, thus averting a lot of the religious wars that caused their creation to begin with. There you go, guys. There's what we know about Thaos. Thank you so much for watching. Truly, just can't thank you guys enough. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.